Hi everyone, I was black in this blitz game, and we opened with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, the Ruy Lopez. I like to play the Berlin defense, which is knight f6, and now my opponent chooses what I call the anti-Berlin, d3. So d3 simply protects the e4 pawn and stays away from the main theory that would occur after castling and knight takes e4. Okay, so d3 is a quieter, more positional way to play. And here I play bishop to c5, getting the bishop to a nice diagonal. And then my opponent played the most common reply, c3. And c3 keeps my knight off of the d4 square, and it prepares to expand in the center with d4. Now, I like to respond with a rare move in this position, which is d5. A much more common move is castles. The reason I don't like castles is because it's a little too subtle for me positionally, and I don't like the move bishop to g5 pinning my knight. The engine tells me best play would continue h6, bishop h4, and then bishop back to e7. And I don't want my bishop on e7 in this Berlin. I want it on c5. Okay, so that's why I like to play this sharper move, d5, instead of castles. And I did notice in the database that Kramnik has played it several times, so he likes d5 as well. He's played it against Magnus Carlsen, Wesley So, Caruana. So d5 is a good move. And now I had an earlier video outlining my repertoire in the Berlin defense, and I considered several moves here for white, but one move I neglected to consider, and I had since I made the video, I had since analyzed this move, was the one my opponent made, which is knight takes e5. Very natural looking move, and the reason I didn't consider it originally is because it was very low in the database. It wasn't played very often by masters. But when I switched to the Lichess database with all of us amateurs, it was very close to the most commonly played move. Okay, so that's what was played in this game, and it looks like white is threatening to take twice on the c6 square. But I had analyzed this previously and discovered that castling is fine, and you can allow white to take twice on c6. My opponent chose to take with the bishop. I wanted to point out what would happen if you take with the knight. Well, I had prepared this line. Okay, takes back, bishop takes c6, and now black has an excellent sacrifice. Bishop takes f2 check. And here's the point. King takes the bishop. Knight comes to g4 with check. And then the king falls back either to g1, which is probably best, or e1. And either way it goes, queen to f6 is strong. There's a threat of mate on f2, and we can recover our piece on c6. So that's what would happen if white captures twice, starting with the knight. Now my opponent started with the bishop, and then I took the bishop, and he took the pawn with his knight, and that is a mistake. You can play like this, but you have to follow it up with the move d4. Okay, after d4, bishop b6, and then maybe white can gain some space here on the queen side. Black can stop that advance. Castles, knight takes e4, and now it's okay for white to take that pawn on c6 because his king is safely castled. So that's one possible line of play. Okay, but in the game, white took on c6. And that's a mistake. It gives black an initiative and too much play. The move I had prepared in my repertoire was queen d6, so hitting the knight. And the knight has to fall back. Queen a4 doesn't work because of bishop d7. So the knight has to go back either to d4 or b4. And my opponent chose d4. If he had chosen b4, then I can take pawn on e4, and then maybe d4 could follow. And then I can take the knight, c takes b4, and bishop a6 is a good follow-up to keep white from castling. Okay, but my opponent chose to drop the knight back to d4 instead. Okay, I took on e4, he recaptured, and I posted my bishop on a6. So black has sacrificed 2 pawns here, but he is much better developed. So black already has 4 pieces out and is castled, and white has only 1 piece out. And these bishops are very dangerously placed, and white is being stopped from castling at the moment. So black has a big advantage in this position. Okay, that's where my opening prep stopped with that move, bishop to a6. Okay, my opponent chose f3, which is one of the top moves by the engine, and it supports the e4 pawn and maybe gains a square on f2 for the king to run to. And I played rook f e8, and I just want to attack the white king now. And the threat is to take on e4 with my knight. For example, just to illustrate, suppose white makes a non-move like a3, then I can take on e4, f takes e4, rook takes e4, check, and there simply is no good way to block the check or proceed from here, and the king is wide open. Okay, so that is the threat, and instead of a3, my opponent tried king to f2. But still, I can take on e4, and I do. F takes c4, rook takes c4. And so this begins an attack on the white king. What do we mean by an attack? Well, an attack usually means that you are sacrificing material in order to open up lines, and you intend to checkmate the king. And so you don't really care about a material deficit when conducting an attack. You're just trying to get your pieces as active as possible. And to be honest, when I took the pawn here on e4 with the knight, I analyzed really nothing. All I saw was knight takes pawn, pawn takes knight, rook takes pawn. And I judged intuitively, and it was a blitz game, but I judged intuitively that black should be winning here because white simply has no development, and all of black's pieces are becoming active. The other rook can slide over to the e-file as well. So you get some intuition for attacks when you play them a lot, and you realize the most important thing is to open lines and get activity for your pieces. All right, now my opponent played bishop to e3, which looks reasonable because it unpins the knight on d4, and it brings another piece into the defense of the king, and it starts to develop. But unfortunately, I have the move rook takes e3 here. And again, I played that with very little thought, giving up more material to draw the king even further forward. Okay, so intuitively I judged this position as winning for black. Now in a longer, slower game, I would have analyzed further here, especially since my next move was poor. I played rook to e8 check, getting my last piece into the attack. The engine doesn't like that. It says right now black has a 10-pawn advantage in the position, and after this move he has only a 2-pawn advantage in the position. Now here's what you could think about. How do we know what move to make here? Well, look for the escape routes for the white king. Where is it running to? Okay, it needs to get out of the center of the board. Well, I would argue it's trying to run to the queen side over here because this knight can come out and perhaps block some checks and even gain another escape square for the king. So there are more pieces over here already to defend the white king. The white king doesn't want to run over to the king side where there are fewer pieces to defend. So because of that, you could find the engine move here, which is queen to h6 check. Okay, that preserves the large advantage that black has. And the reason that's such a good move is because it cuts the king from going towards that queen side. Keeps them on the king side. For example, the king could go back to f2, which according to the engine is the only move that doesn't have a forced mate. But then rook to e8 gets the other piece into play. Queen to f3 is suggested by the engine. But then the powerful move bishop to b7, attacking the queen, and the queen cannot take the bishop because of the response queen to e3 checkmate. Let's take a look at that. Or a quick checkmate, like that. Okay, so that would have been the way to finish that attack, that key move queen to h6. Look for white's flight squares and try to stop him from gaining those flight squares. Okay, instead I played rook to e8, and now the engine suggests he should have run to the queen side with king to d2. And I could still preserve an advantage, but not as big, by exchanging on d4 and then playing queen to h6 again. King to c2 and rook to e2 check. Okay, and white can trade its queen for the rook, but black would continue the initiative. All right, but instead of running to the queen side, my opponent mistakenly ran to the king side with king to f2. And that's exactly where my bishops are pointed. All right, so I followed up with queen to f4 check. I analyzed at that point that queen f4 was winning. And the only reasonable try here is queen to f3. But there's a forced mate after rook to e2 check. Excellent move to see the rook can go to e2 because it looks like e2 is well covered, but it's not. The king cannot take the rook because of the bishop on e6. The knight cannot take the rook because it's pinned, and the queen cannot take the rook either because it's pinned. So this forces the king back. My opponent played to f1, and then I had an immediate mate. If he had played to g1, there still would be a mate with queen to c1 check, queen to f1, queen to e3 check, queen blocks, takes the queen with mate. Okay, so that is an example of attacking the king, sacrificing material to draw it forward, gaining open lines for your pieces. All right, thanks for watching the video.